Welcome to Rooted and Wrestling. I'm Christina, and this space is where I'm going to share my thoughts and heart on the things that I'm struggling with in faith. We can be faithfully rooted and fearlessly wrestle through the hard questions and tensions we find ourselves seeking to understand. I am not a theologian, but I've been walking with God for some time, and I am so grateful to reflect on how God has helped me embrace the many both and moments or ideas versus a simple, straightforward either or conclusion. He's a good God, and He's worth our pursuit. So thanks for being here, and let's get started. So the topic I wanted to jump into today is, should the church engage in cultural topics? Okay, every single one of us has core values and beliefs that shape our worldview. A worldview could simply be defined as how one views the world. And yes, I just use the words worldview to define worldview. But to break it down a little more, how do you think the world works? What do you think is best in the world? What do you think matters most? What is good or what is bad? Why are we, humanity, here? And what happens next after death? All of these thoughts and like purpose, right? What is our purpose? That's another good one. All of the thoughts that we have when we ask ourselves those questions shape our worldview. How do we define success? What do we value most? So then we also have this idea of theology, and theology could simply be broken down into the two parts. Theo, which is relating to God or deities, and ology being the study of. So we have theology is the study of how we relate to God or deities. And so I wanted to start with those two simple words because when we are thinking about how we engage in culture, our worldview and our theology are really monumental to shaping that. I want to kind of share, I guess, my experience, and I'll kind of talk as sometimes with we because Bill and I are very intertwined where we talk all the time. And so Bill and I, we moved to Seattle back in 2012. We initially at the time were not attending a church. Bill and I came to faith in college. And what was really interesting about our college is that it was a military academy that had people from all over the country there. And we also had foreign exchange students. And it was just fascinating because we had exposure to people who were Christians for much longer than us, grew up in Christian households, and came from all over the country. And so different denominations and different subtle differences in how they believed or what they believed, I guess. So that was really like the intro to how our faith grew in the college years, was learning from people from all over the country and different cities, right? Like culture looks different considering what neighborhood and area that you're in. Fast forwarding, like I said, we got out of college and we actually lived in St. Louis for a time. And Bill and I both grew up in the Midwest, and I grew up in Denver as well. Then we ended up moving to Seattle in 2012. We did not immediately get into a church, but the church culture looked very different in Seattle. What we kind of observed was there was not as many churches. It definitely had a greater secular feeling. But then there were also churches that would hold an affirming view. And so an affirming church has to do with sexuality. So the LGBTQ plus community and how we engage with sexuality. It looks different in an affirming church. And then you have biblical churches, which there is a whole spectrum of what a biblical church and how their views differ on the topics of sexuality and gender identity. This topic was much more at the forefront. Just in our neighborhood, there were several churches that would have rainbows on their signs, and then there were other churches that wouldn't. And so the next part is, when you're looking at a church, so like a year and a half in, we started looking at churches and trying to decide where we wanted to go. the church websites, they have a what we believe section, right? And this is true for like any church in the country, I'm sure. If you go to their website and you look at what we believe, there's probably a tab somewhere in there. And you'll get a rundown of what the church believes about the Trinity, what they believe about creation, what they believe about sin, our sin nature in Adam and Eve, what they believe about salvation, among some other core topics that I can't think of right now. So that is how you might kind of get an idea of what you're walking into at that church. And also, like, they'll have like a what to expect tab for how their church service worships and everything. But specifically looking at the what we believe sort of topics in Seattle, you will find statements related to sexuality specifically, and that's where you'll see what a church might believe that would fall into a biblical setting where God created Adam and Eve, and that there are unique differences, and how the two sexes coming together represents God. And then you have, varying levels of belief there. There are other topics such as women in leadership that you will see very, very clearly defined. So if a woman can be an elder or a pastor, or if a woman falls into the deacon category, like that, those sorts of things will be laid out. And even for a time in 2020, when BLM was at its height, we had churches also sharing what they believed about racism. I might further add that I wonder if, because many of these churches are non denominational and not from a specific denomination, you end up having these conversations more so and needing to define beliefs versus being in a larger organization or denomination. But yeah, I'm not sure. All in all, I would say that churches in Seattle and I think Portland and California, the West Coast in general, fall into this category where there is maybe a more, I don't want to say like need, because it probably could be useful anywhere, but there's a greater engagement in these cultural topics and being sure to speak on them, because one might say that clarity is kindness. And so if somebody wants to attend the church, having some clarity is big, and can be very, very helpful with that upfront approach. This particular topic was discussed in a Java with Juli episode called Can Biblical Churches Be LGBTQ Friendly? So, specifically, just looking at this topic, I was listening to this podcast, and it was kind of just reminding me to reflect on how the churches that I've been involved with, how they do or don't engage in cultural topics. And I highly recommend, if this particular topic related to LGBTQ friendly and being a church, how that looks and how that plays out, how like a church, actually the capital C church, goes about engaging. And this episode was a great one. So I will be sure and put it in the show notes so you can look at that and then go find it, because it was a super useful and good conversation. Check that one out, because I'm giving credit for where this thought really sprung from. But more loosely, thinking about churches engaging in cultural topics. So, moved to Seattle, like I said, looking at their what we believe, trying to join a church, that was a huge part of how we approached checking out churches, was to check out what we believe. And we did land in a church home out there, and we were at that church for the majority of our time. And then in 2021, we moved to Florida, and we basically approached checking out churches very similar, checking out what we believe on their website and maybe watching a couple sermons online before deciding to attend. And what was fascinating at that time and what stood out for us was like the first one or two churches that we went to their webpage and we looked at their what we believe, they were absent how they thought about biblical sexuality. And I can remember sitting in the car with Bill and turning to him and saying, they don't have a statement on sexuality. My reaction was, in the absence of not having a communicated, clear statement about sexuality, it must be an affirming church. And of course, that actually isn't the case at all. But I found that most churches around here, we're in, Northeast Florida, they do not, in their what we believe section, have these statements like related to women in leadership, related to sexuality, related to racism. Those, they just weren't there. And so Bill and I just had a conversation, a couple years ago when we were trying to figure out where we would next go to church. And it was just kind of a, hmm, okay, these areas are doing this differently. Like on the West Coast, this is front and center and it's spoken about and where a church stands on a topic. And down here, it's not even mentioned. So what's the better approach? Right? Like, is the providing upfront information, clarity, and kindness, or is it just not talked about? And this is what folks around here told us is that, well, yeah, it's because everybody just agrees upon those things, so it's not even mentioned. Which of course, I also find hard to believe because yes, we might be in what is a more traditional, family-centered, more conservative area, there are still plenty of people who think differently about sexuality and think differently about men and women. I mean, even within a church, you have differences of opinion on these topics. And so it can't be that it's just not there, right? But it simply it hasn't been maybe as front and center. So it's not discussed. And again, I kind of ask myself, is there a better way? Like, is one way better than the other? I'm not entirely sure, because the maybe the pushback I would say to engaging in every cultural touch point is that you can just get too in the mud, and having a church stand for some things that actually have a lot of like non-essentials. I mean, there's a quote. So you may have heard in essentials, unity, in non essentials, liberty, and in all things, charity. A church taking like very firm, like this is what we believe on, you name the topic. That is like a topic. For example, a church taking a stance on which president they should follow. That would be a topic that I would not want a church to divide because that's not essential. And so having a very firm what we believe on that topic would be very unsettling and also maybe bothersome because I don't think that that's a prescriptive thing that we should be overly exerting what we stand for and then kind of suggesting that the whole church ought to fall in line with that topic. And I think even when our church in 2020 engaged in the BLM movement, and by engaged in, I just mean they wrestled with how we ought to approach that topic and sharing that everyone is created in the image of God, so therefore all people deserve dignity, but choosing to how to go about acknowledging racism or past racism or current racism or systematic racism. Our church engaged in that topic and they did provide a statement. And again, like at that time and that topic, our church statement, I didn't fully agree with. And I had friends in our church as well that they didn't fully agree with how our church was kind of landing on their conclusion. And so this is where it's like, oh, I don't know for sure if engaging in every cultural topic is of value because there is liberty to have varying views. But on the other hand, as I mentioned, just specifically with like the LGBTQ friendly and how a church falls on that topic, can clarity be kindness, right? And so that Java with Juli episode, I just loved how they talked about being upfront and providing some clarity because if you have folks attending the church, this particular episode chatted about a church in San Diego and how they do a 2.5 hour introduction, what we believe course, and biblical sexuality is part of that conversation. And how they feel on this topic is that there will be far more damage 2 years from now if there is a gay couple in the church and they're courting and then they come to the pastor in 2 years and ask if the pastor will marry them and they don't align in views. That has far more collateral damage than sharing where a church stands at the front, because sharing that information at the front gives the ability for the people to choose, like if even if they don't agree on all of these things, do they still want to partake and be a part of the church and be involved in small groups and be involved in volunteering? And it's from this angle and perspective, it's a very loving thing to do to engage in that topic because it is a large one and it's very upfront. So ultimately, I'm going to answer this one as I feel like it depends. Man, I am so thankful that I am not a leader of a church. I'm not in leadership. I get to attend the church and I do studies and all these things, but I have not fallen in that realm of leadership beyond a small group with my husband when we were leading and hosting a group for years and years. But we weren't at the higher level of the church that had to make these hard decisions. And I am certain that it would not be easy. It would not be easy at all to try and decipher what we believe and what matters most and what we should like plant a flag in a topic versus what there is a lot more liberty in what might be considered a non-essential topic. I don't know. I don't know. And so I hope that maybe this leaves you a little unsettled too, to consider. I mean, have you even thought of these topics? If you haven't lived in different areas, you may have not even been aware. If you haven't had to church shop, you may not even have been aware that websites and what we believe statements are front and center. And for some, that is the way that a person goes about deciding to attend a church or not. It can be just really uncomfortable to consider if you yourself have even thought about these topics and what you believe on these topics, to have the humility and the grace and the curiosity to leave it open-ended and allow it to not completely rule and be a point of contention and focus so much so that you walk away from your faith, right? But I do think this can be a valuable thought exercise when it comes to evangelizing and whatever city you're in, whatever neighborhood you're in, whatever is the highlight, what's the most important thing that from a cultural standpoint that isn't necessarily the church, seeing those differences and similarities and seeing where maybe something shouldn't be as prescriptive, maybe something shouldn't be essential, maybe something should be essential, and what shouldn't be. God is so kind and so patient, so loving and so gracious to meet us where we're at, to help us grow where we need to grow. And I think considering cultural topics and worldviews can be a huge part of helping us understand and relate to people and be loving and relational and truly have a heart to care for what we might say is the lost sheep, right? Like, I mean, with God, there's a lot of non-essentials and profound things that we don't really fully understand. So at times, kindness is clarity when we can give it, and other times we need to leave space. There are those that are lost, and there are those that are found who have placed their trust in Jesus. And there is a place for helping the lost find God and find Jesus. And I think that we can't ultimately remain silent on cultural topics, but I think that there's a wrestling for how much do we need to engage?